lunch, Aniba told me that the introductory CS classes at Cornell have over 1,000 students, and there are so many that people just stand because there are not enough chairs. I have to say that that's probably bigger than the entire government and history department at the university combined, and I find that rather shameful, because in opening government we think that the role of universities isn't just to produce mindless robots that are willing to enter the corporate field and do exactly what they're told, but rather to produce critical thinkers and people who are able to understand society at a much deeper level than they currently do and they otherwise would have in the absence of the strong humanities. I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about the role of universities, kind of framing this debate and what you ought to care about. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the social good universities provide and the ways in which knowledge production operates as a result of the humanities being declined. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about why life in the university gets worse for students who are in these majors overall. So first, on the role of universities. We think universities hold two broad roles in society. First is we think that they foster the independence and critical thinking skills of students. Because note that this is likely both the paradoxically first and last time that students are exposed to things other than the drudgery of high school or work. That is to say, you're able to self-select into courses, you're able to do what you want, you're able to take a wide variety of fields from a wide variety of different scholars and gain a much more critical perspective on the world. Note that this is unlike any other experience students face in their other lives. That is to say, in high school things are selected for you, and when you go to work you often don't have as much freedom because you're working under a boss. It means that students have entry into society for the first time as independent actors, and you need to facilitate their ability to have independent critical thinking in order for them to be successful in society and to fill what we believe the role of the university is. But secondly, recognize that universities have a strong social impact. That is to say that the non-economic material goods they provide often solely come from the humanities because they have externalities that aren't entirely profitable. In addition, the things like knowledge production that I'll talk about is really important in universities. So, let's talk about the ways in which knowledge is produced and why the decline in humanities hurts that. Note that universities have an extremely important role in modern society. They're the centers of knowledge production, where academia gets careers, where students begin to understand what exactly is the norms of acceptable discourse and thinking because of what's included in things like syllabi and what they discuss in class. It's where people have futures and careers in fields that regardless of whatever major they pick. We think that the decline of the humanities massively hurts the ability of students to get a diverse perspective in the university careers. Here's why. Because note that often the humanities are the only places where students are exposed to things that normally they wouldn't be. Things like feminist studies, LGBTQ studies, Asian American studies, diverse things that often don't have a direct profitable aspect in their lives. The decline of the humanities often hurts these fields the most. Here's why. First, because these fields are often newer. That is, they don't have as much faculty to defend them in board meetings, especially when budgets are much more constrained. In addition, recognize that they're seen as less profitable, which is something that's much more something that's much more snowballing when universities feel that these fields are in decline and there's a sort of race to the bottom effect. Finally, note that when faculty and students leave because there's no opportunity in these fields, either in their careers or at the universities, it creates a snowballing effect that further destroys these fields. Note the impact of this. There's a significant amount of erasure in the humanities. That is to say that there are often either no professors teaching things like gender studies or indigenous studies, or very few professors, or the professors that are teaching it don't have things like stronger tenure tracks. The thing that happens is that the vast majority of students either don't see these fields as what's going into, or it means that they never enter one of these classes in the first place. This has rather pernicious impacts. It means that classes get cut entirely, or fields get cut entirely, or they get smaller, meaning that the fields are viewed as only for the people that the major describes. So, like African American studies, only for the black people, because there's only a smaller class, and the field gets increasingly less diverse. That's why the mass amount of faculty in the American Studies department and the Indigenous Studies department in Yale, last week, resigned because of the lack of support from the university. This is extremely important because it's often the only place where students get exposure to these. It means that cultural erasure in places like literature and what you emphasize as normal literature or what sort of historiography you learn is particularly important. Especially because the humanities aren't disappearing entirely. So what's likely going to happen is the normal mainstream westernized version of history and literature exists, but indigenous studies are the ones more likely to feel the greatest cuts. Meaning that it's not just that students are being denied access to these fields, so they're not operating on a blank slate. They're often being indoctrinated by the very mainstream norms that universities we think are designed to help counter. Closing?
Yeah, so why do you think it's any better for students to take a class in one of these areas than go do kind of exploration or research on their own?
Because you often can't just decide a topic to explore in a vacuum. You often have to be exposed to a wide variety of fields in the first place. Also note that research and things like the humanities are things that often get cut the most because schools would rather redirect that money into STEM in the first place. In addition, recognize that overall in society this has rather pernicious impacts. That is to say, that it's not just that the universities or students who otherwise would have entered these fields that get hurt in the first place. It's that you can't do things like have all students in your college take distribution requirements in these classes in the first place because these fields don't exist. It means that even a cursory level understanding of these fields or of these indigenous experiences that you otherwise wouldn't get on, you otherwise would get on our side, disappear entirely. The impact of this, you have a lot more you have voters and people in society who are a lot less welcoming and a lot less understanding of these fields. I'll take opening because I have to take two.
Okay, the problem is that in many of these cases, going into the humanities doesn't translate into real-world impact because you're saddled with student debt. You can't focus on spreading the message or being an advocate when you still have to sell out, try and get a position, and therefore you have all these harms accrue anyways.
I'm going to address this later, but note that the likelihood of less university support is greater in the snowballing effect when universities don't perceive these fields to be profitable. So you're less likely to take students who are poor who might go into history versus one who is poor and might go into STEM because the payoff for them is greater if you're talking about this crap. So it means that voters are much less exposed to things like literature, history, and understanding of different cultures around them. The impact of this may seem small, but note that this tends to compound. That is to say, voters who are initially more welcome to these thoughts tend to be more willing to vote against racist politicians and dogmas. So they're more able to understand stuff and be less susceptible to populism. And this is the thing you have to weigh against the POI we got from OO. That is to say, that the social impact of more physics majors is likely to be marginal because of things like innovation take a long time to produce. But the social impact of wide distribution of knowledge amongst voters is likely to be greater in the sort of policies they vote for. Second argument, or third I guess, on why it's bad for students in these majors. First, it becomes even more difficult to get jobs because universities are unwilling to do things like pay for career assistance or internship centers, because the very problem opening up, as we talked about, gets worse. But secondly, now, this is sort of a personal rant on my part, it's that people are often forced into things like pre-professional culture, because in the absence of a viable life in the humanities, you're often forced into doing things like what would make your resume the best, which we have to do things like go into pre-professional events, which we think is particularly harmful for students because it forces them to hierarchical modes of thought. They're often biased in the way that they recruit things, and they're often extremely stressful to students. They can't focus on what a university life should be, but instead always have to focus on how you get into that business club or business frat, and how your cover letter and resume should be polished, as opposed to doing things that we think the fundamental aspect of university should be. We're incredibly proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister. I'm happy to call the leader of the opposition.
Ready? Thank you, panel. The false promise made by universities throughout the early 1900s and the mid-1900s was one that offered opportunities so long as access could be assured. But it was a false promise because it perpetuated inequality insofar as it mounted up student debt onto people who weren't aware of the costs that would come up. It was a system of inequality because it primarily admitted women because they weren't able to access traditional institutions of power such as STEM due to stigmas, and we are very happy that that decline has occurred because what it represents is a societal shift. A societal shift sparked by two different things. First, that the historical trend of people who are disadvantaged and unable to access things like STEM fields due to biases or due to things like they didn't have connections in those fields naturally dissipated. So for instance, you see a massive shift from women who traditionally entered into the humanities going into other subjects. The second thing that we've built historically is that it is an awareness from the vast majority of students that the likely career programs that you could get through the humanities are quite grim in the vast majority of circumstances. And unlike what open government tells you, the vast majority of universities don't offer those career opportunity centers unless you happen to be from Cornell. And even in those kinds of circumstances where they do offer those sorts of opportunities, it is still not sufficient for them to make a functional living. It might make things marginally better, but never sufficient enough for people to make a full living. And on the context by which this has occurred, we are very, very happy that the decline has continued and will continue to happen afterwards. A couple of things I'm going to do. First of all, some brief rebuttal of the claims that we got from the opening opposition, opening government. Then I'm going to move into three claims. First, I'm going to talk about social utility. Second, I'm going to talk about student debt. And last, I'm going to talk about women and disadvantaged minorities. To begin with, some brief rebuttal. Claim number one, that the role of university is to facilitate independence, critical thinking, and social goods. I want to note here that, first of all, many students choose to enter university as a tool of socio-economic mobility. I think it's rather privileged for them to say that this is the goal that we should have, given the fact that it's marketed as a way for many people to be able to access socio-economic privilege. The second claim that they have is that for students, this is going to change their perspectives and make it so that they don't vote as liberally. Like, come on, do you actually think that the average university student, even if they're in computer science, will vote Republican in the vast majority of circumstances? No, because university campuses, by their nature, already self-select for people to be liberal and already have liberal campus cultures. So it's very difficult for them to prove that impact or that the margin of voters is large enough to sway whole elections to actually materialize anything meaningful on their side. I'd also like to point out that in many of these kinds of circumstances, the fact that you are oftentimes saddled with debt means that you can't access and advocate, use the knowledge that you have, for instance, to agitate within society and to cause other people, who are likely the most important people to convince, to vote in different ways, because you need to focus on making a living. So you're more likely to become a Starbucks barista, for instance, or pursue things like internships, pay off your debt, all those different things at the expense of being able to create meaningful social change. The last claim that they have is that this is worse for students. I just think that the problem is the vast majority of schools on either side of the house do not offer these sorts of opportunities, and even if they did, it would not make up for the shortfall and the massive amount of harm that's caused them. Claim number 1, social utility. I want to point out that undoubtedly, while in an ideal world, people should be able to pursue the high-minded goals of things like a thirst for knowledge, that is not presently the society that we live in. In the society that we live in, there are massive problems that currently exist. Things like significant amounts of climate change which are threatening people, water scarcity and water shortages for the vast majority of people, the fact that finance markets aren't accessible for the average person, they can't make gains when they put money into their banks. All of these things are rectified on our side of the house. It's important to note that the reason why people self-select out of the humanities is because of market forces. That is to say, there are significant market forces that say these other fields are more valuable, and the reason why they're more valuable is because they lead to more tangible gains, things that affect people on a day-to-day basis. Why is it so important, thus, that we have every single student go into this, or as many students as possible? Because to be able to access the benefits of research, or to be able to get new scientific breakthroughs, you need more minds, you need more collaboration, and we're not even certain whether or not any individual can do it other than that special individual, so getting more people in means that you're more likely to get that discovery and much faster, saving lives of millions, and in the case of climate change, perhaps being able to avert it before it is too late. Now, this is an important thing. Let's weigh it up against all the benefits that we get from their side of the house. Because even though we agree that sometimes knowledge is important, it is not an objective good which affects everyone. The ability to understand philosophy, for instance, isn't that large of a good in comparison or to the person who is struggling and unable to properly find water in a sub-Saharan African country. This is an objective good which helps those who are most underprivileged because it provides the most objective bases of good, like providing more financial growth, like providing scientific advancements that help people who we think are arguably more important than academics within elite ivory towers. So I just don't think that their arguments were comparative in terms of the scale of the impact. Claim number 2, why is this better for individual students? I think another thing that's important to characterize about these careers is because market forces say they're valuable, you're remunerated more for them. I think this is conceded to by the opening government team, sure.
The reason there is a lack of socioeconomic mobility through humanities is a product of this decline, not a consequence. Given that the rates of philosophy hiring and finance have doubled in the last decade, why is this strictly a causality that's true?
I disagree, because the problem is there aren't as many things for these people to do. The vast majority of fields that you can enter as a philosophy major is to become an academic later on, which I think is something which is already limited and constrained in their thinking by the fact that there's one professor for every 100 students. So the ratio will always be skewed, whereas there's always a need for more doctors, more engineers, etc. I think that's important to know. So, yes, opening.
So it's not just students who can't go into majors, it's entire departments that get their funding cut or have their staff cut, meaning that independent of career benefits, societally, we are worse off.
Okay, the first argument explained why those societal benefits matter less than all the benefits that we explained. Again, knowledge is important, not as important as the massive productivity gains, and certainly not when the impact that you hang your hat on is voting changes. So, the effect of student debt on these people is that it ruins their lives. Because of the fact that they aren't able to get gainful employment, they are oftentimes saddled with significant financial debt that leads to mental health problems, makes it impossible for people to start families. I also want to point out, though, that the decline represents those who need socioeconomic mobility the most. The people who stay in philosophy are those who are already privileged and wealthy. The people who move out are those who use universities as a tool of socioeconomic growth. Finally, I want to point out that the benefits that come from their side are diminished when you have massive debt for the reasons I identified before, because you're saddled with debt and unable to agitate within society, use that knowledge in other meaningful ways, oftentimes aren't able to even get a job as faculty within these kinds of places. Final thing, on disadvantaged minorities and women. I think it's important to note that women were historically excluded from STEM and other fields, and that they are now entering it, which represents part of the decline, and a large part of that decline of the humanities. This has two implications. Number one, this is just better for women. They're able to access higher paying jobs, have more capital, be able to have a more successful professional life. But the second thing is better for these fields because, for instance, algorithms, which are oftentimes racist or sexist, or things like that doctors are only taught how to treat heart attacks for men, it gets rectified when more women enter the field and teach about those things. For these reasons, I'm remarkably proud to oppose. Thank
Thank you.
I think the about student has its own deputy prime minister.
Here.
To suggest that the only impact that came from Jinmo's speech is about voting is like laughable, because what the real impact of this debate is indigenous departments and studies getting cut from a university. It's things like minority studies being relegated to that one small building that's the corner of your university where only the black people go there because they're the ones who are doing African American studies, right? It's things like people from other majors, like STEM majors, not being able to take these courses as distribution requirements because there simply aren't enough resources and professors and faculty to expose them to this thing, which means they're forced into the exact same culture that means they're likely to vote in ways that harm these people in the first place. And I think that the lack of response to that is a huge, huge problem. A couple of things in this speech. First, a little bit of extraneous rebuttal. Second, on like the value of a STEM degree. Thirdly, on knowledge production and on pre-professional culture, which wasn't responded to at all. So first, the first thing to point out in terms of framing is what's the realistic trade-off in this debate? Because I recognize that the realistic trade-off in this debate isn't all of these people going into CS majors. It's more likely these people going into other things that are closely related, like social sciences or political sciences, which is like similar in terms of impact if they want to argue that on their side of the house. Maybe they get slightly more impact. But what this means then is you never learn things like history, which teaches you specific reasons why like minorities have been disenfranchised and require reparative measures. It doesn't teach you philosophy, which means you're unlikely to learn, for example, the specific reasons why you should care about certain arguments or certain people, even if that's a harm to yourself. These are the specific trade-offs that happen. It's unclear what the real trade-off that they give us is, right? But let's buy that there's some trade-off here for a second. So extraneously, I want to respond to this argument on student debt. The first thing is non-responsive to both Jinmo's speech and the POI I get from CG, which is saying they flip the causality, right? That is say the reason why you're more likely to be struck in debt and unlikely to get a job is because these fields are declining, because you often enter into these fields and then later realize there's no job for you to go, right? But also recognize that like there are a lot of reasons why people self-select into these majors before they come into this realization, right? For example, you're passionate about these things when you entered college in the first place. You took a course that you really liked. The problem is once you're in that major already, it's significantly harder for you to get out of that major, but then you're screwed over a lot more on their side of the house when you don't have grants that you can apply to as a student, when you don't have like colleges having like programs that you can apply to for PhD programs, which means you're stuck without a job. Which is significantly worse off on their side. But also like on like a trade-off on comparative, right? Recognize that the other majors that are traded off have significantly more cross-applicable skills, which means those people are probably better off if they have fewer jobs because they can still apply to other positions and other jobs that make their lives significantly better off, but the trade-off on the other side is not symmetric. But in terms of student debt, what do we get, right? We get things like better financial aid for these particular departments, which means you're actually able to admit people who have like financial need but are unable to get into these things in the first place. It's things like you have more jobs that you can apply to, which means you can be in these majors more securely and aren't forced into applying to things like finance, which means you're going against the very kinds of things that you learn and make your societal impact worse off, right? And like you just like don't respond to this. Let's talk about the role of universities. The only thing they say is the value of a STEM degree is more for a couple of reasons. Couple of responses. First, I would contest that the value of a physics major is like significantly more than the value of like a philosophy major, because like the vast majority of these people are probably like trying to prove equations that were done like 80 to 90 years ago. I know, I was there, which means that like the vast majority of work you do doesn't have real impact on society in general, right? It's most realistically proving like string theory, which doesn't like actually benefit anyone in real life right now. It's just like proving something for self-gratification for the most part, right? But also secondly, right, like what Jinmo says is important, because you say like, even if you buy that like some of these people have impact on society and some of these people don't, the impact on our side is on every single person who takes these classes in and out of these majors. That is to say, every single person who takes these classes and every single person outside of these majors who are better able to take these classes for distribution requirements are better off as voters. They're better off as people who are able to critically think about the kinds of policies that they want to vote on, the kinds of people they should care about, things like reparative policies, that they should be more cognizant about specific impacts that happen on these things. So on a weighing metric, if you said, even if we buy that some of these people have an impact on society, we have a significantly better impact on every single student in that society. But also lastly, I just contest on face that you're going to be the next person to come up with a thing that solves climate change. Realistically, because the specific trade-off we're doing is about students who are on the margin, right? Because some students who will always go to humanities and some students who will always go into STEM fields, which means the specific people we're talking about who are considering going into STEM fields who are now going to humanities are unlikely to be the ones who are coming up with these like miraculous discoveries that change the world. It's most likely the prodigy who's like a 13-year-old who sits in my physics class, the one who's going to do that anyway. Let's talk about knowledge production, which they do not respond to. I'll take closing if they have anything.
You can take them first.
Good.
Your benefit is to the 3% of people who go to university. Our benefit suggests that even if you don't get the wide-scale changes, you still need engineers to make roads, you still need doctors to treat people, and those benefits are more dispersed, and in fact, those who are most disprivileged.
Yes, those people will still exist. The realistic trade-off is like econ majors, so like people in finance, right? That's the realistic trade-off in this debate, not like CS majors who are probably not considering humanities for the most part anyway. Let's talk about knowledge production, which they literally don't respond to at all, because what Jinmo tells you is that when there are cuts to these, like the grants and the money that these departments get, the specific ones that get cut are things like indigenous studies, or like feminist studies, or like the studies that are like the least likely to have like the newest studies, which are like have like significantly less backing from presses. But here are a couple of other reasons. These studies end up taking disproportionately more resources for a couple of reasons. One, there's less groundwork done, right? A lot of the work that you have to do is like starting off and like starting a department to study this like indigenous culture that has never been studied by anyone else in the rest of the world. But also two, it's because a lot of these things are like oral traditions, for example, aren't written down, which makes it significantly harder for you to like do this work, which means it takes a lot of effort to do these things. What's the problem when these things get cut? One, we would say on principle it's problematic that they get cut because it leads to an erasure of the specific cultures they talk about, which means that the only things you learn about are things like Shakespeare, which means that you never get an idea of like the people who are historically left behind and never allowed to have their voice said in society. Closing.
Yeah, why do you think that a switch from a humanities field such as history to a social science such as political science would make people less informed or more likely to forget about the past?
Because the specific things you don't learn about are the historical reasons why these there's like disadvantages that happen. You don't learn about the massacres that have happened when people come into your country and like destroy Native American populations, right? The specific things you need to learn to make you a more empathetic voter are ones that are about history and about like the philosophical reasons why these things are problematic. And this is probably the biggest impact in the debate, right? That is to say, we make these people significant. One, we erase these specific cultures and studies and histories, but also two, we make these people less likely to care about these issues, right? But also like they just say, university students are like liberal. Yes, once you start earning money, you stop being so in the first place, right? You never get contact, for example, with like poorer people whose communities you don't live in, which means the only contact you get with these people is these classes that you go to, which means you care about these things. And lastly, in terms of like women placing in STEM, I would contest this on face, right? It's untrue that in like India, for example, where there's no humanities, like the engineering school has like 15% women, right? It's unclear why like the trade-off realistically is for these women. But also, again, like it's probably like you're less likely to get promoted if there are more men in that field, right? So it's unclear what the benefit are to these individual women. Anyway, for all these reasons, we're very proud to do this.
I want to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, why a decline in the humanities was needed to shake that institution out of its complacency. And it's only because humanities have seen a decline in number of students attending them that it's forced institutions and subjects which were previously dominated by wealthy white men to justify their relevance and to diversify. Secondly, I want to go further on why we get more natural science and why we get better natural science, because that's really important. Before that, a few points of rebuttal and rebuilding from the first three speeches we hear. The first thing I want to deal with is the claim from the DPN that the trade-off won't be more people dropping a humanity and entering science subject, it will be more people going into economics. I think two responses. One, the same structural changes, namely the fact that there is a far greater need, both for us as a society and from the economy, for instance, people who can do a great job researching climate change, will mean that you're more likely to choose the hard natural science. But even if it's the case that people just move into economics, I would contend that that is more good in terms of the big impact that they claim, which is awareness of racial disparity. I think it's probably far more useful if, for instance, you study economics and can formulate a real and realistic program of, say, reparations for African Americans, than if you simply study slavery as an abstract thing. I think actually you can do more good even if the only thing people do is enter into social sciences. And I want to make it clear what we think the trade-off in terms of education that individuals undergo really is. I want to point out that it is far easier for someone without a humanities degree to engage with literature, to engage with history and philosophy, than it is for them to engage with hard science. A couple of structural reasons why that's the case. Take it from me, guys. I'm a history graduate student. All I really need to do is read books. I don't need specialised equipment, which you do need for hard social sciences. I don't need to be taught abstract concepts. I can improve my own learning, my own understanding far easier than I would be able to, for instance, teach myself complicated maths, or certainly know how to engage in experiments. What that means is that our side of the house gives individuals a far greater ability to engage with both aspects. It gives you the ability to both learn complicated physics, while also in your private life read and broaden your mind in that way. Finally, I want to note that opening government have this deeply elitist and patronising view of social change that essentially says the only way in which we can get anti-racist activism is if people take African American majors. I want to note that there are huge numbers of instances where working class women, working class people of colour who had no degree whatsoever were able to successfully organise and lobby for social change. So we think this is a huge red herring. What does Jason bring you in this debate? Firstly, he points out that we currently have huge social problems which are not just serious, but they are existential. If climate change continues to go on, we won't be able, as a human race, to enjoy the good life. We think it's imperative that we get people into these areas soon. But secondly, areas like, for instance, artificial intelligence can often enable people to lead a good life. The invention of the washing machine, I would contend, a science invention, probably did far more to advance the interests of women as a class than more people taking gender studies, because it enabled people to have that free time to engage. Finally, Jason points out that the change we are seeing is we are seeing a change in a world where individuals were essentially tricked into taking humanities subjects, where people were told you can study a history degree and it will be fine, you can still go out and get a good paid job. And the reality is that's a lie, because the economy has changed, because you often need specialised scientific skills, you need specialised high-level math skills to be able to get those highest paying jobs. That's why closing government are wrong. It is obviously the case that to an extent a decline in the humanities means that there are fewer history professorship positions. But the changes in the economy means that there is simply a finite number of positions where a history degree can do you any good. I would note that you can still think critically while doing a medicine degree. You can still learn problem solving that can be applied to other jobs, but you often need that deeply specialised training in order to succeed. I'd like to take a POI. Or not. Okay, let's talk about how this improves science. Jason gives you a number of reasons about why a greater number of science majors is likely to boost scientific research. I thought it was absurd when they said there is a finite amount of useful professions for scientists to go into. A couple of key examples, right? We think a greater number of science majors means it's simply easier for you to, for instance, set up a company researching drugs because there are more people with that skill and because the cost of labour of hiring researchers goes down. That means we get more scientific activity. Secondly, a greater number of people who've been educated in hard natural sciences means we have a far better quality of teaching. I want to note that a major problem that previously existed was that an undersupply of math graduates meant that often primary schools and secondary schools didn't have specialised maths teachers and they instead employed history graduates. The comparative we get on our side of the house is when we have more individuals taking hard sciences, they can then go into schools and teach that to kids in the future. That means A, those children have the ability to access those subjects in the first place because their maths teacher was actually competent and good, but B, it means that those people can go into those subjects because under the status quo, it's often only the richest kids who can even get access to STEM subjects because of a lack of teaching. Go.
The people who are likely to figure out artificial general intelligence are probably the people who are prodigies who are taking grad level course their freshman year. The specific people who we're talking about are likely to just be a drone who's working at Facebook, only like making their life worse for everyone who works at that company.
I think that's true to a limited extent. There are fairly low-level research jobs which are key in developing new drugs, new things which can deal with climate change, where you do need bulk. You also need a bulk of teachers. The improvements that this will bring in terms of STEM subjects is that we now have the ability to solve social problems, but also do things like correct inbuilt social biases. Given that a lot of this decline has been women, for instance, moving from humanities degrees into hard science, that's enormously important and probably more beneficial than their nebulous voting things. Finally, I want to talk about the humanities, because I want to note that under the status quo, a decline in people taking the humanities have forced those subjects to become more relevant. It's only that decline which has forced history to justify its relevance to present-day students. That means there's now more study of African American history, and it's in fact the sort of white history, the history of kings and queens of Britain, which is getting cut. We now have a more responsive humanities subject on our side of the house that can educate people about current problems today and can also seek to improve social sciences by, for instance, engaging in more interdisciplinary retraining. On their side of the house, the humanities will remain cocooned in a complacent bubble. I'm so proud to oppose this motion.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and Head of the Member of Government.
Everyone ready? This debate has focused on an incredibly small and elite group of people at the expense of the broader society. What am I talking about? The conception we've gotten from both teams, for the most part, is that what your college major is an apprenticeship for your job. You're going to become a scientist and study global warming, so you need to know about the climate. You're going to go into finance, so you need to learn about the economy, or you're going to proceed into academia, and this is the first step in doing that. For the people who are really driven to do those special fields, they are not the marginal person who's picking what field to do. They have a passion that has decided them, at this young age, I want to go into academia, I want to be a scientist. The people we are talking about, for the vast majority of people, and the people who decide very on a whim and are able to be swayed by the culture around them, what college major they take, are the vast majority of people for whom their college major is not a skill, but a signal to employers. What does that mean? For middle managers, car salesmen, real estate agents, the vast majority of college graduates do not use the knowledge they learned in college, but use the skills that they learned, and is a signal to tell their employers, I'm someone who's competent, I was able to write essays that got an A, you should hire me. That is what most people use their college education for, not for skills, for signaling and for skills, not for the knowledge that they learn in that particular major. I'm going to give you analysis then about how stigmatizing these majors is uniquely harmful for disadvantaged students and pushes people away from the skills and lifelong enjoyments that they would otherwise most enjoy for this vast majority of people. Because keep in mind, almost no one uses their knowledge. We're talking about a piece of paper that you get when you're 20. It does not determine the course of your life for people who change jobs multiple times and go into different careers not related to becoming a scientist or working at Goldman Sachs. So, why do we think that they create a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because the core of the opening opposition case is that you just can't be employed if you're a history major. It just doesn't happen. That is insane. Most people do not, or philosophy majors, don't go into academia. They do other things, like I did, right? I'm a philosophy major. I just had a conversation with someone who I knew from another thing, and he was also a philosophy major, and we talked about that. Just like you share fraternities with people, or share sports and common interests with employers, this is something, and your college major can be something that you share with an employer and talk to them about. They create a situation where these become increasingly marginal things, where all of a sudden people dismiss English majors as frivolous, but also the employers of the future aren't English majors themselves. They view the subject less seriously, and they don't have that common bonding experience. In the future, it's going to be much harder for someone like talking to me to meet a philosophy employer who was themselves a philosophy major, like I was able to meet a philosophy major and talk to them about how I got something out of philosophy and how I used it to become a better writer or critical thinking fields that I think are important. But also, keep in mind that the turn away from humanities isn't just associated with people saying STEM is great. It is associated with saying English is frivolous, and the people who are left in the English department are the people who couldn't do STEM. The subject that a lot of this says is often when people, like I tell people I'm a philosophy major, they'll say, oh, good luck getting a job, right? There's an implicit assumption that people who are doing these aren't doing them because they love them, it's because they were forced into these things and it was a last resort that they had to choose. This means that when they increasingly isolate and cloister humanities majors, they're not leaving them no worse off than they were. They are creating the problem that they try to solve, where you can't get a job, where these things are stigmatized. Why is that uniquely bad and harmful? Because for the vast majority of people, what do they want from their school's education? They want basic writing skills, basic communication skills, and a signal to employer. They will not use the international relations, the economics, or the scientific knowledge that they happen to remember in a lecture they were likely hung over in the first place. What are the three unique harms of pushing people away from these skills they would have found? One, it uniquely harms underrepresented and disadvantaged students. Mathematics, STEM, and economics, and things that are quantitative are by far the hardest fields for disadvantaged students to break into. That's why in CUNY, basically their school was so inaccessible to the vast majority of New Yorkers that the only way to get people in was to not require algebra to get into college. That was the only way they could have the sizable portion of disadvantaged students they wanted to get in our school. The achievement gaps in reading and writing are real, but in math and science, they are much, much wider. These things are taught much worse, and they are much more seen as much more inaccessible. Additionally, because the knowledge builds on each other, often it means that if you come in writing bad essays, people will teach you how to write a better essay over time. You may fail the first class, but the next class, maybe you get a B+ on your paper because you're teaching it. That doesn't happen in STEM, where the classes build on each other. If you don't understand intro calculus, you can't move on to secondary calculus. What does this mean? Disadvantaged students who are in STEM fields have by far the highest dropout rates compared to humanities fields, where you often have more time and more of a learning curve rather than a cumulative system where they're already at a disadvantage to start with. What does this mean? Creating a stigma for the places where often disadvantaged students have to go to catch up in the higher education system means that you stigmatize them more and hurts their social mobility. In a world where you say only physics majors can get jobs and only the physics majors are the smart kids, is the world where you hurt the people who can't do physics because their high school didn't prepare them to do it and didn't have a physics program or a calculus program at all. Secondly, what happens? It stigmatizes the skills you most need to succeed in a modern economy. What skills are we talking about? Communication and writing skills. They say that math is the most important thing. The math that it can't be done by a computer is incredibly complicated. Accountants, paralegals, people who are doing math at a basic level are being automated by machines. You need communication skills to avoid the AI revolution. Opening.
Okay, most countries accept large amounts of immigrants in the sciences. It is not because English degrees are stigmatized, but because there's a massive shortage of specialized skills. This is a misrepresentation of the economy in the vast majority of cases.
So for people who are going to become scientists, we always need more scientists. Those are not the people in today's round. People who want to become scientists will become scientists. They were not going to become English majors until they heard this resolution. We're talking about real estate agents, middle managers, people who are like the average college graduate who is not going to use the knowledge they learned in college, but the skills and signal they picked up with a college education. What does this mean? We're pushing people into math skills that are increasingly going to be automized by computers. The amount of math that the average person can do can already be done by Wolfram Alpha in 5 seconds. That means we're pushing them away from the communication skills they will actually need in a modern economy. Third, we list out a source of lifelong enjoyment. The DLO says, you can always learn literature later, but you can't learn science. Most people don't want to learn science. It's not a fun thing for most people to do. Most people want to read literature, poems, all these things. If you're never exposed to like jazz or classical music or poetry at a young age and learn to get a feel for those things, those aren't things you can pick up in later years. Television lasts for 5 seconds and you forget about it. The lifelong joy of literature is missed out when you miss this opportunity.
So CG literally asked OO a POI in which they claim that actually philosophy majors are reaching record rates of employment in finance. And then their extension tells us, well actually the increased numbers of people in STEM has made these fields, such pariah in the kind of employment schemes. These kids will just never be able to get a job because of how much we look down upon the humanities. Guys, I think you need to decide which of these it is. The empirical evidence that you yourself cite actually shows the otherwise, shows the contrary. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we don't think these people are really left in the dark. But in extension, I'm just going to take a bold stance and tell you why we think humanities are just not a worthwhile endeavor for society, right? Because I think we've got a lot of back and forth about humanities are okay, they teach some skills, but maybe science and tech is better. We're just going to tell you flat out, humanities, really not a place that we should be investing any of our human capital. But first, a little bit of rebuttal to what we hear from CG. So the first thing they tell us is this stuff about stigma. So as I've already noted, their own POI kind of refutes this. But secondly, I think that actually what happens is at the point at which there are far fewer, English and philosophy majors, and at the point at which the skills that John talks about are true, I think that what actually happens is that those majors just look more unique and interesting to employers. So for example, when I applied for finance jobs, a lot of my employers were like, oh, philosophy, that's really cool. That's something different from the slew of Wharton kids that we've been getting interviewing here. And they actually wanted to talk to me a little more about the major. But look, we think that insofar as the stigma is true, it's probably causality, right? That is to say, employers recognize that there are fewer important skills that these majors impart, and that is the reason why fewer people decide to study it in the first place. It is not the other way around. Next, we hear some stuff from the CG about why this is really bad for disadvantaged kids, because it's really hard for them to access math and science. Well, we think that on our side of the house, an increased focus on STEM as the most important way to get ahead financially in life has actually led to, for example, increased rigor in elementary schools and in high schools that actually teach kids more of these skills that they need to learn. So the literal existence of the acronym STEM and STEM programs has pushed more teachers to be able to teach these kids pretty well. It's caused more charities and more programs that have tutored these kids in these schools. It has led to more access to this kind of tutoring and support, even at the college level. I think their solution is just to leave these kids in the dark and never let them access this field that they might actually really like and have a lot of talent in, but just because they happen to be born, in a society that didn't think that it was worth it for them to ever have to learn these kinds of things, they're shut out in the dark. Look, we don't think it is reasonable to just tell these kids, you have to study this because that's all you'll ever be good at because of where you were born. That's ridiculous. But then he tells us these skills are really important because you need to be able to communicate to avoid artificial intelligence. So the first thing to say here is that you don't need to be able to write an entire PhD level thesis in order to communicate with Bob in accounting about what you need him to do. But secondly, we think that these jobs are also increasingly being automated. So see, for example, that there was literally debate AI that Harish debated against. But the fact that some law jobs, low-level law jobs, are literally also being automated to help people, for example, get out of traffic tickets. I don't think this is a true conception. But finally, the last thing that CG talks about is these unique skills that you learn in the humanities major, and I'm going to deal with that directly in extension. Before that, I'll take a POI.
Yeah. Universities and academia are often the only places where research on non-mainstream fields such as indigenous studies, international literature, and different narratives for history are done. Engagement with these fields, independent of career outcomes, is the only way, or the strongest way, in which people gain different perspectives on narratives that they're often drilled in high school.
So I'm actually going to talk an extension about why we think these fields of study are actively bad for social progress, and why we think there are other avenues that people can actually go into to learn about these fields. So I'm going to address that in just a second. Great. So again, why do we think humanities are not a worthwhile endeavor for society? A few reasons. The first to say here, and this is like relatively kind of straightforward, is that these fields are just not objective, right? So we think a lot of the times the analyses in humanities fields are purely subjective. This might sound fine and dandy, but we think that there's less focus on analyzing evidence, but rather what scholars in these fields do is just interpret evidence arbitrarily to fit some preconceived thesis they had. This is literally what people do in, for example, philosophy of mind when they're like dualists or materialists, and they just look at neurophysics to find evidence that fits the theory that they had beforehand. Or for example, Marxist historians who just like try to look through the evidence and find things that supports their theory arbitrarily rather than analyzing the evidence in any objective way. We think this is actually not great for critical thinking or tolerance insofar as it just actually teaches you to interpret evidence and things that you see in the world to fit your own preconceived notions about the way the world is. So that actually clashes directly against OG's notion of critical thinking and these skills that you learn. We think it results in, for example, broad focus just on name recognition, like, oh, I should take this theory seriously because this famous person from Harvard published it, as opposed to any, objective kind of metric by which you can evaluate it. We think that's really bad, kind of like debate. The second reason why we think this is really bad is because we just think there's no intellectual progress, right? Like, I challenge anybody on GovBench to name me one example of progress in philosophy in the last century. Like, one dispute they settled and decided never to come back to. They were like, guys, we did it. Like, I would truly love that. One objective interpretation of Kant. That would be awesome. We just think that the value of discourse in these fields is diminishing. There's little value in each additional interpretation of Kant, in each additional radical feminist theory that all just point out the same problem in slightly different ways and aren't actually useful in applying them to the problems we face today or in solving them at all. The third reason we think that the humanities are broadly just not that great is because they're kind of, as has been hinted at, elitist and inaccessible. So, it tends to be richer white kids who can afford to do this because they don't need to be as concerned with their earning potential in the future. For example, at Stanford, this is just a weird statistic that I happen to know, like only 3 out of 10 of the AAAS, the African American Studies program professors, are actually black. There are like a surprising amount of white people teaching African American studies because they tend to be the most privileged who can afford to go into those fields. This is harmful for 2 reasons, contrary to what we hear from OG about how these classes and these fields are so good. First, it's harmful to make these people the intellectual demagogues and leaders of these fields because they don't have intersectional experience and people defer to their opinion as opposed to people of color on the ground. But second of all, in the ivory tower, which is mostly theoretical, we think very few of them actually lead movements in activism, and we think, no thank you, this is actively bad for activism, since it shouldn't be necessary to know radical feminist theory to participate in the movement. We think this kind of, highbrow knowledge actually alienates lower class people from the movement. They're the people you ought to care most about because you need to be intersectional and care about those who are most vulnerable. Finally, we think there are just no unique skills, contrary to what CG tells us. Look, critical thinking is non-unique. It takes a lot of critical thinking, no thank you, to be able to solve a math theorem. It is not clear to me why these are the only avenues for you to do so. We also think STEM fields are becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. For example, at Stanford, there are lots of majors like CS plus English or whatever that require some base level of ethics and writing in the major. We think that you can get lots of these skills that are in STEM fields as well. They have not named a single unique one. Finally, though, what do we think happens on our side of the house? In the status quo, there's just too much competition for humanities professor positions, because there's a limit on how many new analyses of Kant we need. We prefer a much smaller and diminished number of the most qualified and dedicated humanities people going into the field because A, there's less competition for fewer jobs, which is actually the reason why it's easier for philosophy majors to get finance jobs. Secondly, because we think classes become smaller and more intimate, which means that you avoid the 1,000-person lecture halls, and if you really, really want to study humanities despite everything I've just told you, you're likely to get a better education because the class sizes are smaller, the professors are more dedicated. Finally, we think they can actually focus on the most important subjects of their field. We think it's not likely to go away entirely because there's a huge cost these universities have invested in these programs, because of the selling point and point of differentiation for potential students, and because it would be hugely unpopular amongst professors and students. Look, broadly we think it's good that less people study these fields in exchange for fields with more objective progress and societal utility, but we think for the couple of people who really insist on studying them, they actually get better education in the long run. Incredibly proud to propose.
I think a member about the human habit of all the government work.
Speaker, the social context of this debate is disconcertingly missed at every turn. One, businesses, institutions have become and are becoming increasingly socially embedded. They have social responsibilities, they have more interaction and more reliance on communication. The impacts of signalling are more salient now than ever. Two, there is a technological push which is literally closing the space that they tell you exists for the types of empirics, the type of STEM, the type of applied math that they want to develop at the point at which it can literally be replaced increasingly by technology. Three, this is a society which reifies class binaries on the premise of intellectual knowledge and the accumulation of things like historical facts. All of those things and all of those trends within society mean that at this point particularly, all of the signalling that John gives you is particularly important, and therefore the decline that has been entailed to humanities ought to be reversed at this specific point in time. This is necessary context and framing for the material I'm going to give you. Firstly, to deal very clearly with the flippant tension that supposedly points out by CEO, it's not a tension, it's literally that as a Stanford graduate, yes, as a philosophy graduate, you are able to achieve a finance position because of the very signalling effects of Stanford. This is also about the signalling effects of having a philosophy degree in the first place, not just about you being from Stanford and being able to attain that job. In rebuttal, one, on CEO, they tell us why humanities are literally futile. I'm going to give a broad refutation to that, but also then intertwine most of their case with OO. Secondly, on OO and their mechanistic confoundment. Thirdly, on OG and why they miss the mechanism that we give you to their very access of the benefits they want to claim. One, on CEO. They tell us that this isn't an objective pursuit and therefore ought not be valued. I want to know what part of that case deals with why we should care whether or not this is an objective pursuit. That is, writing skills and the signalling is what people benefit the most from our case. And this is where they miss the extension. Because it's not necessarily about reaching the answer that they want us to. It's not necessarily about literally having some revelation within philosophy. It is in the didactic and pedagogical process of going through the critical analysis that is required to even contemplate these questions and applying that analysis to other aspects of your life where you actually may be able to pursue and achieve those very results. But second of all, ethics and aesthetics are still important in and of themselves to your lives. I'll deal with that more substantially later and why they are in and of themselves good pursuits to have. But thirdly, they just objectively have been the sorts of progresses that they wanted to ask of us, i.e. changes with Wittgenstein and Kant's scholarship have been reshaped by different norms over different periods of time, different modes of philosophical inquiry, and have shaped the way that you conceive of ethics within current society. But I'm going to deal with most of their material under the branch of OO because I think that a lot of it actually does fall in to some of the similar mechanisms. First, OO.
Okay. Many brilliant people can succeed at the humanities or medicine, and then going into medicine will inspire you to become a doctor. Your frame is wanky, over-intellectualized, and is a misrepresentation of how the average person makes the decision. They don't make the decision before they enter the degree, they do when they enter it, and that's the benefit we get from more medics and engineers.
A few points. Again, they miss the causality because, again, if you have the stigma that they want to develop by the decline of humanities, this is true. It may be the case that literally under the status quo, you don't think you can access any job within the humanities, therefore you make the decision within the degree knowing that you can't access anything in the future. We reverse that etiology that has come from the decline of humanities. The second part of this point is to say that, again, the wanky part that they're pointing to is only the case because the only people left in the humanities who feel like they can actually pursue some long-term career are the intellectual elite that they want to talk about. Yeah. That's exactly the social norm you ought to rectify, and the only one we do through the signaling effects of that degree. Secondly, on OO, their case pivots broadly upon two simple premises. The first one is a lack of economic knowledge precludes you from these job markets in the first place. I tell you first of all, again in the context at the start, that the sorts of trends that are occurring within the business market, either they're necessarily going to hire you, but that they ought to, and that they have more of a desire to hire the sorts of people who would come out of the skills from a philosophy major. That is to say, companies, again, see themselves and are expected to be increasingly socially embedded, to be increasingly interactive. Second of all, most of the sorts of benefits that come, most of the sorts of knowledge that is necessary for finance is experiential. I challenge you to find one bridge Bridgewater graduate who actually uses their knowledge that came from their Ec 10 degree and actually applies that in a tangible way. The point is they don't, but they do use the signaling effect of their degree to actually understand, to project their intellect and therefore be hired on that premise. Their last push here is to say that there's incredible specialization which is needed for STEM, etc. And this is where they really lose the debate, because there are a few points here. Firstly, we agree. Therefore, that is always going to be exclusionary at the very top end, particularly to minorities, where you literally need years and years of cultivation of a particular trait, of a particular capacity within STEM, i.e. having access to textbooks when you live in the Bronx and in an underfunded area in schooling. All of those systematic qualms that they wanted to talk about are exactly the ones which are amplified by their model. Before I go on, I'm going to take CO.
Why is it the case that humanities skills are easier to learn? And if they're so much easier to learn for disadvantaged students, doesn't that also somehow make them less valuable because they're not as rigorous or difficult to acquire?
A few points why they're easier to learn. The first one is that most of them at least can be grounded in some level of experience. That is to say that in a lot of cases, an Indigenous minority has more knowledge about their own Indigenous history and their own Indigenous past than someone else has access to. That gives them a comparative advantage. They say that means, oh, you have more access to it, therefore it's less rigorous. No, the access is literally based on your individual experience, and therefore you don't lose the rigor, or you don't lose the unicity of that trait. You just lose the fact that you just literally mean that it becomes more mainstream. So we agree. Then they say that debt-straddled college students are the one that suffer. They have to make a decision here, because the debt-straddled college student they want to talk about is not the one who's going to go into scientific research for the next 15 years on environmental sciences and saving the world with environmental science. Because quite literally by their own analysis, these are exactly the people who can't pursue that sort of future. So either the jobs they're talking about are accessible under humanities, or, and this is where our extension becomes and beats them out, there is a critical mass of dead-set science majors who will not change. Therefore, what is this debate actually about? One, it's about those who use their degrees for signalling. Two, it's about the implicit assumption that these disciplines are lower and at the expense of the Australian Indigenous student who wants to study their own history. Minorities who want to access the cultural capital which the elite have a monopoly over. Four, minorities whose comparative advantage is in the humanities. And five, people who need to develop social skills and the capacity to communicate in a world which is becoming increasingly dominated by technology. Those are exactly the mechanisms which also access the benefits from OG. That's why we're incredibly proud to propose.
Everybody good? The only question I have to the government whip is how many people can even pronounce Wittgenstein, let alone know what the advances in his theory were, let alone care about them. And then even of the subset of people who do care about them, how many of those people really understand what he was trying to say? What we're going to bring you, uniquely on closing opposition, is the futility of the humanities, why that's so important. We are going to escape this kind of back and forth about causality in the decline of the humanities and how it relates to minorities and their reputation, simply by explaining to you some key areas in this debate, right? First, on universities and knowledge production. I would say this is broadly what characterized the front half of this debate, but it's something that will fall out as being mostly unimportant after we talk about our extension, right? OG gets up here and they say that the humanities are incredibly important, and they're important because they're the only way that college students are forced to interact with subjects that they otherwise would never have any access to. They're the only way that you can create some kind of informed voter base, people who will engage in society in a way that you think is super valuable. First off, we explained to you that on either sides of the house, most of the knowledge that you actually care about people accessing is available outside of universities, right? So as I flagged in a POI at the very beginning of the round, you can read James Baldwin without being in an African American studies class. You can read the news without being in a civics course. There's absolutely no reason why people who are otherwise intellectually curious and choose to study the sciences won't actually be able to engage with the humanities in a more, fun way outside of the classroom. Then, the closing government comes in, and they say that the point of universities is actually to allow people to use their degrees as a signal, right, and to benefit from these basic levels of communication skills that they say are so important. Well, what does a degree signal actually looks like? They try and tell you it looks like what university you went to, and obviously to some extent this is true. But what we tell you is actually the greater signal of your degree is what you studied, right? So even in an ideal world where John could just get off with the fact that he went to Harvard and didn't learn anything there, and use that as a signal to employers that he is worthy of employing, we tell you that a much better signal, one that is much more indicative of your capability as an employee, is what knowledge and what skills you have coming out of college. Broadly, yes, all humanities degrees give you basic communication skills. We're not going to contest that. But what we tell you is that on the whole, your average science or engineering degree gives you a lot more specific applicable skills that make you able to do a job that you would not be able to do with some kind of generic general ability to communicate, right? We don't want everybody to come graduate and work for McKinsey. We would rather have a lot of people designing the new next innovation that will solve something like climate change. Did you have a POI?
So, you fail to notice that we are treaded on a trend. In a world where fewer and fewer of your potential employers respect English makers and it's more and more seen as frivolous, it becomes harder and harder to get a job and have a viable future with these degrees.
Okay, so that directly engages with what Danielle tells you, which is actually that because there are always going to be these kind of rich white people who study these things, they'll always maintain their base level of importance in society, for better or worse. We're not going to be able to erode it completely, and it actually just means that the people who do still study it and the people who are privileged enough to continue studying that will have more opportunities because they will have more time with professors, their job will be more unique, the fact that they're a philosophy major. So we don't think that the people who study it are hurt. But even if they were hurt, that would be totally fine for us, right? Because what we tell you in extension is that humanities is simply not as useful of a field of study as the sciences, right? And we give you 3 specific reasons that go completely unresponded to as to why it is better to study the sciences, right? First is that we have more objectivity. That is to say that whatever Wittgenstein's advances are, they will be argued against. It doesn't matter what they are. He has not proven anything, even if his trails of formal logical commands seem to make sense at first, right? What we tell you is that somebody who learns how to design a new mechanical system, or who learns how to desalinate water such that seawater can actually now be potable, those are things that are much more valuable to society and much more useful than understanding Wittgenstein could ever be. And they're more objective, right? They provide something that literally accomplishes a goal as opposed to something that gives people grounds for thought or debate. The second reason we tell you is that there is no intellectual progress in the humanities, broadly speaking, right? The best case for this humanities is that some archaeologist, which is probably not even a humanities, discovers something that then a historian can analyze, right? And maybe they can use contextual clues to find out something valuable about the world. That is the literal best case scenario proctoring of history that only happens 1 in every 1,000 times that a history class is taught or a history professor is given tenure. What's much more likely to happen is that people toil around with secondary source documents, they write essays that don't matter, they answer stupid tutorial questions like I did at Oxford, right? What we have to tell you is that it's much more valuable to have a field that actually makes progress, a field where if you discover a new way of arranging your variables, that your machine learning initiation can actually be something that solves diseases, that is able to diagnose patients better than any human doctor. That is the kind of advancement and progress that we want to see. I will take you.
If people thought sciences were so objective, we wouldn't have climate change denial, right? But the importance of having subjective studies is it forces you to look at other perspectives and recognize that what you're thinking or what you've concluded isn't right all the time.
Okay, so one, we're not saying that subjective studies shouldn't exist, just that they should occupy a much, much smaller subset of academic inquiry. But more importantly, the percentage of people who are climate deniers in the scientific community who have taken a college science class is fucking zero. That's why everybody should take these classes, right? Insofar as we could actually teach people that their phony science is wrong by having them take real science instead of just taking these back and forth philosophy classes where there is no objective truth, maybe people would actually learn the things that we think are really important, right? What does the last reason we tell you for why the sciences are actually better is because they are less elitist and inaccessible, right? That is to say, insofar as the job prospects are not as good, insofar as these are things that you need to have a lot of extra time to spend thinking about, we think they are much harder for minorities and those who have already been oppressed by society to access, right? These are the kinds of things that you can only do if you have a lot of money and you went to Horace Mann for high school. Lastly, in this issue is students, people in college, right? That is to say that the people who go to college are not going to be impacted on either side of the house in any way that is better or worse than they are on the other, right? People study what they are told to study, they study what is in their environment. We think that this happens on both sides of the house. Insofar as, on our side of the house, they are studying something that is much more valuable, that provides society with a much higher value and actually improves their economic job prospects, increasing accessibility, we think that they are better off, right? That is not how you should weigh this debate. You should weigh this debate on what actually happens as a result of the decline of the humanities. What are we seeing in society and why is it better? Because we tell you that sciences are a much more valuable field to study. We escape the causality battle that you hear in the front half explaining why the humanities have in fact regressed, because we tell you that it is better regardless of the reasons we are so proud to oppose.